Well, good evening, everybody. Glad to see you here this evening. We're going to begin a new study this week. We're going to go to the first epistle to the Corinthians, which was written by Paul. I think at this time in this country's history, it's time to look at a church that had real issues, with real concerns with the world around them, and we're going through that a lot right now. So I'd like to do a study on the Corinthians, letters to the Corinthians. We'll start out with the first letter, and then after that we'll probably go to 2 Corinthians. But a little bit about the Corinthian letter. The author, of course, was Paul, and he is joined by Sosthenes, who some think may have been the same as mentioned in Acts 18:17. The authorship of this epistle is attributed to Paul by Clement of Rome in 95 AD. It was written when he was in Ephesus. The time of the writing was probably around 57 AD, shortly before the Jewish Feast of Pentecost, and during his third missionary journey. Now, background on the city of Corinth. Corinth is situated on the Isthmus of Greece, and it's really only about 50 miles east of Athens, and it's above the Mediterranean Sea. It's between the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea. The Corinth that Paul dealt with in the city there was relatively new. The old Corinth, which was famous and powerful in the days of the Peloponnesian War, was burned in 146 BC by the Romans, and it was a city that was devoted to gods, and it took 100 years before they rebuilt the city, and that was in 46 BC. Julius Caesar was the one who rebuilt the city, and he populated it with a colony of veterans and freedmen, and named it, the original name for the city was Julia Corinthus, and it soon became a very important commercial center. Had a population of about 400,000 at the time of Paul's writing, and it was a prominent center of commerce in the Mediterranean world. It was a place of all sorts of vice. In other words, it's just like any other big coastal city. You're going to have all kinds of immorality was found. They had a temple of Venus there, Aphrodite, which had 1,000 priestesses in it, and it was dedicated to prostitution in the name of religion. Its proximity to Athens probably added to the problem of intellectualism. And as noticed in the epistle, in such an environment had its effect upon the church in Corinth. If you look at it from the type of city it was, it's really kind of amazing that a church even existed at all in that city. Now, a background on the church at Corinth. The establishment of the church occurred during Paul's second missionary journey. It was recorded in Luke, Acts 18, in the first 18 verses. And that can be divided into 3 sections, which is the first 6 verses, abiding in Aquila and Priscilla, fellow tent makers, reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, and then in the next verses 7 through 11, where it talks about the house of justice, abiding there and searching for a year and 6 months. And then in verses 12 through 18, and this is Acts 18 we're talking about, an incident before Gallio, proconsul of Achaia. So it appears from the reading of the epistle that the church was adversely affected by the immoral environment found in the city. Pride caused division in the church and disruption in the services, and that's the first 4 chapters. Immorality and immodesty found its way into the church, which gave way to bad reputation, and that's in the 5th chapter. The brethren were also taking their personal problems with each other before the heathen courts instead of working them out among themselves. That's in chapter 6. And there were other issues affecting the church, included questions about marriage. That's chapter 7 of Corinthian letter. meat sacrificed to idols, and that's chapters 8 through 10. Women praying and prophesying with heads uncovered, and that's dealt with in chapter 11. Abusing the Lord's Supper, which is also in chapter 11. The use of spiritual gifts, which chapters 12 through 14. The resurrection of the dead, which is in chapter 15. And the collection for the saints in Jerusalem, which is chapter 16. So this was one church was beset with problems and questions that needed to be answered. That's one reason I think it's a good study for today. We've got a lot of things going on where we need answers, and we definitely have to deal with problems. So, the purpose of this writing was the bad news concerning the problems at Corinth had reached Paul in Ephesus, and it seems that this news came from at least two sources. From the household of Chloe, and in a letter sent to him, possibly by the hands of Stephanus, Fortunus, and Acacius. So, two different sources for his knowing what's going on. So, therefore, to answer these reports, Paul writes, and this is in the theme of it, which is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. So, let's do a quick little outline of the book of 1 Corinthians. And it starts off with just with an introduction, and then it goes into the problems that were reported by the house of Chloe. And this is chapters 1 through chapter 6. And it talks about the factions in the church. And that's the first 4 chapters deals with that. Then it deals with sexual immorality, which is chapter 5. Then it deals with the lawsuits. Remember, I told you they were not settling their differences in the church, but going to courts about it. So that's chapter 6 focuses on that. And then the second half of chapter 6 deals with moral defilements. Then it goes on to the problems mentioned in the letter from Corinth. Remember, he received a letter also. And this is chapter 7 through chapter 16. 7 deals with marriage and celibacy. Chapter 8 through 11 deals with meat sacrificed to idols. And I think we can all know that we've heard a little bit about that. We'll get into more detail when we go through the chapters. Now, in chapter 11, it deals with women praying and prophesying with heads uncovered. It was a big deal in that day. Chapter 11, the second half of that one, deals with the Lord's Supper, and we've heard that a lot just when it's one of the most popular scriptures when talking about the Lord's Supper. Then in chapter 12 through 14, it deals with spiritual gifts. Then, chapter 15, it talks about the resurrection from the dead. And then chapter 16 talks about the collection for the saints. So, then it finishes off with just concluding remarks, instructions, and benedictions, and that's the last half of chapter 16. So, let's take a quick look at some questions and answers about this introduction. So, on which journey did Apostle Paul establish the church at Corinth? He established it on his second journey. Where do we read about the establishment of the Corinthian church? Acts 18, the first 18 verses. Remember, I told you about that. Who did Paul first stay with at Corinth, and what did they have in common? And he first stayed with Aquila and Priscilla. And remember, they were tent makers, which by trade. So that was their commonality. They were originally tent makers. So, which chief ruler of the synagogue was converted? And this is back in Acts 18, verse 8, where it tells us that Crispus was the chief ruler of the synagogue, and he was converted to Christianity. And approximately how long did Paul stay in Corinth? And you remember we mentioned that, a year and 6 months. Who did Aquila and Priscilla convert in Ephesus who later went to Corinth? And that was Apollos. And that's back in Acts 18:24 through chapter 19, where it talks about that. From where did Paul write the first epistle to Corinth? Remember, we talked about that, and we said it was when he was in Ephesus that he actually wrote this, because he got information and letters about what was going on. So what was the approximate date of this writing? And that was the spring of 57 AD. It was just before Pentecost, remember? What two things existed in Corinth that appeared to have an adverse effect on the church? Remember, we talked about it, the intellectualism with its proximity to Athens, and then immorality because it was really a wide open city, as a lot of coastal cities are. If you look about, we talk about the heart of America, where in the center of the country, where it's a more reserved, a more standard area, and you get to the edges or the borders that border other countries or cities where you have a lot of transient people coming through, you end up with a lot of things going on. It just look at some of the cities in California, and then cities even on the East Coast. So, what was the purpose of this epistle? The whole purpose of this was to correct the sinful practices and refute the false doctrine. We'd said earlier we didn't even know how or why this church could really have even existed in this time. But when you're doing the Lord's work, you can succeed, but you're going to have a lot of challenges, a lot of problems, and Paul's purpose was to get this church back on track. And where is the theme of this epistle stated? Remember, I told you that it was in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. And I'm going to read it one more time to finish this study. And that's, "Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment." And if you stop and think about that, if churches today, if the church is going to be successful, they're going to have to do the same thing. We're going to have to stop fighting with each other, arguing with each other, get to the truth, stick with the truth, focus on the truth, and live with the truth. So, that's an introduction to 1 Corinthians. Next week, we'll start with chapter 1, and we'll go through all 16 chapters there, and then we'll move on to 2 Corinthians. And when we get done with this study, I honestly think we're going to gather a lot of ways and strengths and ideas on just how to deal with issues that we're facing in the church, in this world, right now, today. Thank you very much for your patience and your listening and your attention, and I look forward to going through this study with you. Have a good night.